What the I wish I could live in that fridge. It's like 30 degrees in the studio and I'm slowly melting away. Anyway, hi and welcome back to my channel. My name is Falk and in this video I will show you how I created this diorama made from epoxy resin that I enjoyed so much that I did it not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 times until I was finally able to finish it. But let's start from the beginning. When I started working on the Aerosan, I already had an idea for a diorama. I decided that I wanted to try to recreate a scene that's happening on a frozen lake. As you might know, normally I like to use XPS foam and wood veneer as a base for my diorama, but for this one I decided I wanted to play around with epoxy resin for the first time. The first challenge was to create a mold for the epoxy pour. For this I used a piece of acrylic glass and a piece of acrylic tubing that was about 20 centimeters in diameter. I used a combination of super glue and hot glue to glue the acrylic tubing onto the piece of acrylic glass. Another thing I knew right from the get-go is that I wanted to include a piece of fishing line that's visible through the epoxy pour, so you can see the guys standing on top of a frozen lake and doing some ice fishing. For this I used an actual piece of fishing line. I glued it to the bottom of the mold, wound it up onto this cocktail skewer and glued it on top of the mold to make sure that the fishing line is straight in the water. I used an AK Interactive real color marker to color it black and make sure there's as much contrast as possible. And of course, if there's fishing line you also need a fish. I found this pikefish over on Cults 3D and I printed a few different versions, but ultimately went with the largest one. For painting I of course started out with a nice coat of Mr. Cerveza 1500 in black, followed by a coat of Tamiya XF81, mostly applied from the top side. For the sides of the fish I sprayed a nice gradient with AK Interactive Real Color 052, and for the belly of the fish I used Tamiya XF55. After I was done with the airbrushing steps I went to my AK Interactive 3rd generation acrylic paints. I used silver grey again to paint the belly of the fish and also for the pattern on the sides and on top of the fish. To be honest, I could have gotten away with a way less detailed paint job since the fish is barely visible in the end. And also, since I had to do this diorama 4 times until I was happy with the result, I also had to paint 4 of those fish. And because of that, I can now confidently say that this year I painted more fish than human miniatures, and I think that's quite an achievement. Also, I can highly recommend that you paint a fish for yourself, since it's a lot of fun. While working on this project, my girlfriend and I got a visit from a good friend of ours, and at one point at that weekend we were all sitting down painting a pikefish for some reason. And normally she has no relation to modeling besides me talking about it all the time, but we all enjoyed it pretty much, so if you have the chance, print out a fish for yourself and try to paint it as nice as possible. After I was done painting the pattern, I used a few thin coats of AK medium rust for the fins, and then I used black paint to paint in the gills and the eyes of the fish. I scaled down the files a lot to get a fish in this size, since the original model was a lot bigger, but even this small, I think all the details translate really nice, and with a resin printer it's no problem to print them at all. And for what I had in mind with this fish, this is more than perfect. After I was done with my acrylic paints, I used my black AK pen liner to bring out the detail in the fins. I applied it, let it dry for a couple of minutes, and then used mineral spirits to wipe the excess off. The fish then also got a quick coat of Tamiya clear gloss to make it a bit more shiny, like a real fish. And after the clear coat was dry as well, I used a piece of stretched clear sprue to mount the fish in a slightly raised position inside the mold. And now it's time for the fun part, the epoxy resin pour. I used Epodex Ultra Clear Resin. This resin can be poured up to a height of 10 centimeters and is normally used for river tables and stuff like that. And because I wanted to do quite a high pour, this was my resin of choice. The downside you have with a resin like this is that it takes quite a long time to cure, in this case about 4 days, so you have to be quite patient. For mixing I use large buckets and my cordless drill with a mixing attachment. Also, as you can see, I slowly added more and more Tamiya medium blue into my mixture until I was happy with the color. Normally people tell you that you have to be quite careful with mixing epoxy resin so you don't get too much air trapped into the resin. In my case, this wasn't really a problem. This resin is advertised as bubble free. Since it takes so long to cure, air bubbles can rise to the top and you can pop them there using a lighter or a blowtorch. And also, I got myself a vacuum chamber for this project, and since I plan to do a lot more epoxy resin projects in the future as well. After I was done mixing and coloring the resin, I put it into smaller containers and put those into my vacuum chamber for about 20 minutes each. During this time, the bubbles raised to the top, and after I let the air back in, and the leftover bubbles as well were popped without any issues. And then it was finally time for my first resin pour. I used this tongue depressor to add the resin carefully into the mold so I don't get any more air than necessary trapped into the resin. But as I said, since this resin takes so long to cure, this isn't really a problem. And I tell you, you can't imagine how excited I was when I did this resin pour. But that excitement quickly faded away when I realized that I now had to wait about 4 days before I can see end results. And also, since I placed this mold in the middle of my workbench, I wasn't able to use that for like 4 days, and that was a bit stupid on my side as well. And after 4 long days, it was finally time for the demolding process. My initial idea was to break away the bottom plate, then use a saw to cut a groove into the acrylic tubing, and then use a hammer to break the acrylic tubing away. But oh boy, was I wrong. This didn't work that great, and I had to use a chisel to break the acrylic tubing off the epoxy block. And as you can see, brute force isn't the best idea when working with epoxy resin, so of course I did some heavy damage to the epoxy block. But to be honest, at this point I wasn't too annoyed. It was my first try, I tried something new. I failed, but I learned a lot, so I thought everything is fine, just try again. But I also thought at this point the first block cured without any issues, it just got damaged while removing the mold, so maybe use a resin that cures a little faster for your next try. And I did that, and I failed again. For some reason, that day when I did this pour, it was especially hot, and after about 4 hours the resin started cooking off and left all those ugly marks that you were able to see on the lower side of the block. So for my third try, I went back to this lower resin, and as you can see, this didn't look that bad at all. I was able to remove the mold without any issues since I finally knew how to do it. But then I had the great idea to use a large bandsaw to cut off the top layer and make sure that the epoxy block is level. But as you just saw, this didn't work that great either, since the bandsaw a friend of mine owns is a bit old and janky, and I wasn't able to make a straight cut. And surely, at this point, I was a bit annoyed about all the mistakes I made along the way. But I really wanted to make this thing happen, so I decided to do one last try. I once again ordered new acrylic tubing, new epoxy resin, the slow one of course, and I tried it once again. And as you were able to see in the beginning, this one finally worked out. I used my tiny table saw to cut grooves into the acrylic tubing all around and not just in one place. I made sure to cut close to the epoxy resin block, but I was very sure that I won't cut into the block like in my first try. I'm not completely sure, but I think I made a cut every 2 or 3 centimeters, so there were a lot all around. After that was done, I used a handheld saw and cut in the acrylic tubing to create a lot of intended breaking points all around the mold. Then I used a piece of styrene to protect the upper surface of the epoxy resin block, and I started to use my hammer and gently tapped it on the inside of the acrylic tubing to create breaks in the acrylic tubing all around. When you look closely, you can see how air gets between the epoxy and the acrylic tubing. I gently tapped the inner side of the acrylic tubing for about an hour, rotating the block all the time, until I had as much air as possible in between the mold and the epoxy itself. This time I worked very gently and slowly to make sure there won't be any damage to the epoxy at all. Then at some point I had to use my chisel and I tried to pry open the individual pieces of acrylic tubing until one of them came off. And as you can see, after the first one came off without any big issues, it was quite easy to remove the rest of them as well. Oh, and in case you wonder why there was so much silicone and hot glue on the mold for this fourth block, for some reason this mold wasn't leak proof, and after a couple of hours resin started to leak out of this one. So I used generous amounts of silicone and hot glue to close up the mold, and as you can see, luckily that worked as well. And you can't imagine how happy I was after this one finally worked out. I then used my X-Acto knife to cut away excess resin and gave it a quick sanding to prepare it for another resin pour. Let's start working on the hole in the ice. I knew that this would be easier if the hole was there before the ice, so I needed something to plug the hole. And after a bit of thinking, I had the right thing in mind. Round, the right size, and made out of silicone, so epoxy resin won't stick to it. And then I just had to cut the tip and the end off and my plug was ready. And I also learned that silicone is quite hard to cut straight with an X-Acto knife, by the way. And then I just had to glue it in place using a drop of my trusted Tech glue. And of course I had to make sure that it would be right on top of the fishing line that I added into the epoxy resin before. As I said, time for more epoxy fun, so I needed another mold. This time I used clear packaging tape for that. I stuck it around the top of the block I created before, and I made sure that it would be perpendicular to the surface of the epoxy block. And with a bit of work of my girlfriend who held the roll of tape up, this worked without any issues. And since I had a bit of leakage on the epoxy pour I did before this, I made sure to press the edges down firmly so there won't be any leaks on this one. Since the layer of ice is a lot thinner than the layer of water we did before, I was able to use a resin that cured a bit faster in about 24 hours. Also, I needed way less resin, and because of that, this time I used a scale to measure out the right amounts of resin and hardener. And because it was way less material, I was able to mix it by hand. Also, another thing I didn't tell you on the resin pour we did before, you should make sure to pour your epoxy resin into a second container and then mix it again. Sometimes there's a bit of unmixed material left at the bottom of your first container, so pour it into a second one, mix it again to make sure it cures without any issues. As you can see, this time I didn't mix any paint into the epoxy, so it will act as a clear layer of ice on top of the water I created before this. At first I was a bit unsure how thick this layer of ice should be, but when I read that a few lakes get up to 2 meters of ice on top of them, I was quite confident that about 1.5 centimeters on this one won't be too much. This translates to roughly 50 centimeters of ice in reality, and I think that's quite fine for a lake like this. After 24 hours I was able to remove the tape, and that went without any issues. As you can see, there's a bit of sticky residue left from the tape on the epoxy resin, but this isn't a problem at all. I intended to polish this block anyway to make it as shiny as possible in the end. Another thing I didn't talk about before. When I cut away the excess resin using my X-Acto knife on the water layer, I got a few stress marks on the side of the epoxy block. This wasn't really a problem in the end, since I was able to sand and polish them away, but if you're going to do something like this, just sand the excess away. I think it's way safer this way. As you can see, the plug came out without any issues, but the bottom of the hole wasn't completely smooth. Again, not a problem, since there will be another resin pour in a couple of minutes that resolves this issue. But before that, it's time for sanding. A lot of sanding. I started out with a 120 grit and worked my way up to a 3000 grit. And after that was done, I used my cordless drill, some polishing paste and a polishing attachment, and made sure that this block is as shiny as possible. Overall, polishing the top and the sides of this block took me about 6 to 7 hours of work. But in the end it was really worth it, and I was very happy with the result. But once again, this was work that was a bit pointless, because the next step was to destroy the top surface of the ice again. As you can see, the resin got so shiny that my camera wasn't able to focus anything on it. I then used my rotary tool to roughen up the edges of the hole in the ice and make it look more natural. While researching for this project, I learned that ice fishing holes normally are quite small and made using a drill. But for this one I wanted to get a much bigger hole to make it look more interesting and to get the chance to show a bit more detail. Apparently, in the past it was also common to make ice fishing holes using axes and stuff like that, so this was my preferred option in this case. After that it was time to scratch up the ice to bring it closer to reality. And I can tell you I wasn't happy about that. All that polishing work felt a bit pointless at this point. But in the end I think it was really worth it, so now I'm quite okay with it, to be honest. Before we start working on the snow effects, let me take a second to thank you for your amazing support. Every like, comment and subscription helps me in creating more content like this for you. So if you haven't done it yet, please leave a like, leave a comment and subscribe to my channel. And a special thanks to my Patreons. Your support made this video possible. Without you, I would have not been able to start over and over again. Thank you so much for that. Okay, let's now start working on all that white stuff on top of the epoxy base. I used 4 different products for my snow effects here. The first one is AK Interactive Snow Sprinkles. Snow sprinkles look like a kind of wet and a bit melted snow, and I used those as a base layer to map out where the snow effects will go in the end. The snow sprinkles also do a great job of blending the snowy areas with the icy surface. And since this is a water-based acrylic product, you can also blend it even more with a bit of tap water. Then it was time for this creamy stuff, and this is AK Interactive Terrain Snow. And this is a thick paste that's great for adding volume to your snowy areas. Again, this is also an acrylic product, so you can dilute it with tap water or even smooth it out with a bit of water, like I will do in a few moments. Overall, this stuff feels a lot like the putty I normally use for concrete surfaces, but it stays a lot softer after drying. And as I said, after I was happy with the application, I used some tap water on my fingers to smooth out the surface. Before I started working on this block of resin, I tried a couple of different things on the leftover resin from my mixing cups, and I have to say that helped a lot in getting a realistic result without too much trial and error on the actual resin block I wanted to use in the end. The nice thing about working with a large resin block like this is that you can't really mess it up. If you apply acrylic products on top and you don't like them, just use a plastic spatula and scrape them off again. And then maybe use a bit of acetone to remove any leftover. I tried that on one of my test pieces and it worked without any issue. And while the terrain snow was still wet, I used even more snow sprinkles to blend in the snow areas a bit more with the ice surface. While using those products, I made sure to work quite fast, so it doesn't dry too much, and I'm able to remove the masking tape where the Aerosan will sit in the end before the products dry on top. Otherwise, there's a risk of tearing up the snow effects when removing the masking tape. And again, while those products were still wet, I also applied a generous amount of AK Interactive Snow Micro Balloons. In my opinion, the terrain snow doesn't work as a snow product on its own, but if you sprinkle it with the snow micro balloons, it gets a lot of texture and looks really realistic. And there's also another reason to use the snow micro balloons. I used them as kind of a barrier to make sure that the at this point still wet AK terrain snow doesn't stick to the Aerosan model. And of course, they also make sure that the terrain snow doesn't stick to this leg that I used to leave some footprints in the snow. After I was done adding the footprints, I left this thing on its own for about 24 hours, so the terrain snow could dry completely. Normally this stuff dries quite fast, but since my layer was so thick, I decided to leave it alone a bit longer, just to be extra safe. And after everything was dry, I used my vacuum to remove the excess snow micro balloons that weren't glued down yet. And then it was time for even more snow sprinkles. I used these snow sprinkles to brush in a thin layer and the tracks that were left behind from the Aerosan. For one reason, I wanted to make sure that the tracks don't look too empty, and I also used it as a glue to fix the Aerosan in place at this point. And like you would do it with a tank model, I also used my terrain paste, in this case the snow effects, to blend in the Aerosan with the base. And since the terrain snow is so thick, it was quite easy to create small snow accumulation around the skids of the Aerosan. And of course, after I was done with the terrain snow, I added even more snow sprinkles to blend everything together. And after that, you might guessed it already, I also added a nice layer of snow microballoons. Unfortunately, for some reason, the snow sprinkles were able to reactivate the red paint on the skids of the Aerosan. I'm not sure why that happened, but for some reason a bit of red paint bled into the white snow and that looked a bit ugly. But I was able to fix this mistake with a bit more terrain snow and even more micro balloons on top to cover the red paint up. Let's now start working on the ice hole. Once again, I started out with the AK snow sprinkles and applied them to the inside to create a bit more texture. Also, in a later step, I will use those snow sprinkles to blend the hole into the rest of the ice surface. And then I reattached the fishing line. I drilled a small hole right on top of the fishing line and that's enclosed in the resin block. Then I used a piece of the same fishing line, painted it black and glued it into place using CA glue. After the fishing line was secured into place, I used my microphone stand that I now use to record this voiceover to make sure that the fishing line comes straight out of the resin block. And then I mixed up another batch of epoxy resin, this one a really small one. I mixed in a bit of blue Tamiya paint to match the color of the water underneath and then poured that epoxy resin into the fishing hole to simulate the water that pushed up through the hole to the top of the ice surface. I then used a small piece of wood and a bit of steel wire to create a very basic fishing rod. And to be honest, I don't really know anything about ice fishing or fishing in general, but for this project I did quite a bit of research to get it mostly right. I've also read about tip-ups, but I thought for this project the basic fishing rod would look a bit cooler and is maybe more readable for someone who doesn't know anything about ice fishing at all. To secure the fishing rod into place, I drilled two small holes, one for the end of the fishing rod and the other one for this Y-shaped piece of seafoam that will hold up the front of the fishing rod. And after the epoxy resin was cured and the fishing rod was put into place, I threaded the fishing line through the small loop in front of the fishing pole. Unfortunately, this footage is a bit blurry, but since you all enjoyed the finicky parts so much on my FW190 build, I thought I need to include this footage here as well. And as you can see, I wound up the excess fishing line on those small metal pins at the grip of this fishing rod. And now we finally get to the small bonfire, by far my favorite part of this diorama. I don't like putting LEDs in my models, and I think that a fire made from plastic and then painted doesn't look too great, so I decided that I would include a bonfire that's only smoldering a bit and it's mostly burned down already. I started out with a seafoam twig that I broke into pieces to create the wooden logs that would go into the bonfire. Those were then coated with a thick coat of acrylic earth by Games Workshop. This is normally a paint for dry, cracked up ground, but it also works really well to simulate the effect that burning has to a piece of wood. I then used AK Real Color NATO Black as a base coat. NATO Black is quite dark, but not completely black, so it looks way more natural than a pure black wood in this case. And then it was time for the part that was a bit tedious. You can see all those small, I would call them islands all over the wood pieces, and I started to paint them individually. For this I once again used my AK 3rd generation acrylics. I started out with pure grey blue and then started to mix in white in larger and larger quantities until I got nice contrast and highlights going all over the wooden pieces. While doing this, I looked at a bunch of reference pictures to make sure to recreate the effect as nice as possible. And after that it was time for the actual glow effects. I started out with a base coat of AK titanium white ink in the areas where I wanted the amber to be in the end. In my experience, white ink in this case is way better as a base coat than normal white paint, since it has a lot better coverage. And since it's so thin, it's also flowing nicely into all those small crevices on the wooden logs. After the ink was dry, I started to glaze different colors over it. I started out with AK Fluorescent Orange. I used a bit of Games Workshop Fire Dragon Bright because I had it lying around. I used a bit of Scale 75 Crimson paint, and for the hottest areas I used a bit of Games Workshop Flash Gits Yellow. Normally I'm not the biggest fan of those Games Workshop paints, but in this case they worked really well. And as you can see, it's not too important to only paint the areas between those individual islands. It's no problem to paint over them, because in the next step we will establish them again using the grey paints we started out with in the beginning. It also looks quite nice to glaze a bit of the AK Fluorescent Orange over areas that weren't base coated white beforehand. This way you can create a bit of glow around the ember. And as I said, I came back in with the grey paints I used before to paint the islands, and I re-established them. And this way you can achieve the look of the ember sitting inside the log and not on top of it. When I started to paint the bonfire, I posted a couple of pictures of it over on my Instagram page and also on Patreon, and I got a lot of positive comments about it. So I decided to include the full tutorial in this video as well. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you try to recreate it yourself, please send me pictures of it. I would love to see it. To create a bit more texture, I added a few small bits of seafoam that I painted with dark grays, and also a bit of pigment. I mostly used AK Burn Jet Engine pigment since it's a bit sparkly, and also I used the white one to simulate the ashes on inside the bonfire. And after all the individual pieces were painted, I glued them together using super glue. Before I glued the bonfire to the base itself, I also started working on a small cooking tripod. For something like this I prefer to use steel or brass wire, just to make sure everything is straight, since styrene profile might bend over time. I arranged the steel wire on a piece of cork so they stick into place without any glue at first, and then I used a bit of super glue and fishing line to tie them together at the top. I had the idea of hanging a tea kettle over the bonfire, so I also added a small piece of chain. And after that was done, I used a bit of super glue to glue the bonfire in place and also the cooking tripod. As you can see, this wasn't painted yet, since I wanted to do it later when the snow effects all around are finished. Speaking of snow, let's put down a few lines. I used a spatula and the snow micro balloons to create these lines of snow around these scratches in the ice. When something sharp like skids scratch over ice, they grind away a bit of the ice, and that accumulates in white piles of snow and ice around the scratch itself, and I will try to recreate this effect here. I tried different techniques for that. The issue is, if you put down the snow first and then you come in with gravel and sand fixer, there's a small chance that the gravel and sand fixer moves away the snow microballoons that you just put on your base. But using a brush to apply the gravel and sand fixer carefully almost completely eliminates this issue. But in a few areas, as you can see, I had to do a bit more work afterwards. And while the gravel and sand fixer was still wet, I again added a generous amount of AK Interactive snow micro balloons, as well as the ice sparkles to create a bit of glamour. The best way I found for adding these snow micro balloons is to put my brush in the container and then gently tapping it over the surface where I want to apply the micro balloons. On a surface like this, the gravel and sand fixer takes quite a long time to dry, so after I applied everything, I left it alone for a couple of hours. And then I also added more snow effects to the front part of the diorama. I don't have that much experience with snow effects and modeling, so I decided to build the snow up in layers before I do something wrong. And for me this technique worked quite well in this case. Around the ice hole I again applied a lot of snow sprinkles. Snow sprinkles look kind of wet compared to the other snow products I used, and since water pushes up all the time through the hole in the ice, I thought this would be fitting for this area. But of course, to make it less boring and create more texture, I applied even more snow micro balloons, and as well as the ice sparkles. At this point I also posted a bunch of in-progress pictures on the internet, and Someone over on Reddit mentioned that normally when you make a hole in the ice, there's a ring of crushed ice around the hole, so I again used snow sprinkles in the later step to also recreate that ring and that accumulation of crushed ice around the hole. And of course I also used the snow sprinkles and the terrain snow to blend in the bonfire. At first I thought that the bonfire would sit clean on the ice because all the snow around it would melt away, but after looking at a lot of reference pictures and reading about the physics behind it, I decided that it would be way more realistic to leave a bunch of snow around the bonfire as well. After the gravel and sand fixture dried, I noticed that it made the resin surface quite dull, so I added a generous amount of AK Interactive wet effects to bring back some gloss and also to create more texture on the ice to make it look more interesting. And as you can see, even more snow micro balloons. And although I'm used the snow sprinkles quite heavily, I barely got through half of the package, so I guess I have the chance to create even more snow dioramas in the future if you like this one. And if you want to see more of that, let me know in the comments down below. And for the icy area on the front, I tried a different technique. This time I put down the gravel and sand fixer and then added the lines of snow micro balloons. And this technique worked even better. This way I didn't run the risk of the gravel and sand fixer washing away the snow micro balloons in the end. And if you don't have a spatula to bring the white powder in lines like this, you can also use your credit card for that, without any issues. And of course, even more snow micro balloons as well as the ice sparkles. After that was done, I again followed that up with a heavy layer of AK Interactive wet fluids for a bit of gloss and even more texture on the surface. To create this bit of texture, I turned the pressure of my airbrush way down. This way, it barely sprayed any wet effects fluid out and created all those small droplets all over the surface. And at this point, the snowy area around the front skid looked like it's there just to cover the front skid, and it looked a bit artificial. So I added even more of the terrain snow paste, a bit more snow sprinkles, a bit more snow micro balloons, as well as some ice sparkles for good measure. And as I said, at this point I also recreated the circle of crushed ice around the hole. For this I used the snow sprinkles as well as the ice sparkles to create a more icy than snowy look. And in case you wonder, I didn't worry too much about snow micro balloons or ice sparkles getting on the water inside the ice hole. First of all, I think it looks quite natural, and second, it's quite easy to wipe down the resin water in the ice hole. And maybe you already spotted the small mistake. Unfortunately, one of my tools got stuck with the fishing line and I damaged it and made a kink in it. So I had to rebuild the fishing rod and the fishing line later in this project as well. But since the second version looks exactly like the first one, I didn't bother to include it in this video. And now it's finally time to work on the last missing details, the cooking tripod for example. I used my beloved Scale 75 Artist Acrylics in the color black as a base coat and brushed it onto the cooking tripod. Steel wire doesn't take paint too well, so it took me about 2 to 3 coats to get a nice and even coverage all over. And unfortunately, because of all the bright ice and snow on this diorama, my camera at this point had a really hard time focusing on the small details I added, so I'm sorry if a few parts are a bit blurry. And if you know me, I guess you already know that my favorite color for steel parts is German grey as a base coat. I applied a bit of German grey and then I took a few lighter greys and added a bit of texture on the tripod. Later I also added a light rust wash all over, but I kept the effects subtle since I didn't want to overpower the bonfire underneath the cooking tripod. And before I forget it, before I started painting the small chain on the cooking tripod, I gave it a quick coat of AK gravel and sand fixer to glue the individual links together, since I don't like moving parts in my diorama too much. And of course, the chain got the same paint treatment as the rest of this cooking tripod. I was quite sure that I would be able to find a leftover tea kettle somewhere in my bits box, but unfortunately this wasn't the case. So, as always, I jumped to my computer, opened up Fusion 360 and quickly designed this small tea kettle that you can find on my Patreon page now for download if you need one as well. Then I printed it out and started to paint it. And since there wasn't too much painting included yet in this diorama, I decided to go for a non-metallic metal finish on this tea kettle, like you maybe would paint it on the miniature. The downside with non-metallic metal finishes is that normally they only look good from a certain angle. But since there's so much light in this diorama because all of the reflective snow, I thought it would be quite fitting here, and it's not a problem to paint highlights all over the teapot to show the light reflecting on it from different angles. I really enjoy painting non-metallic metal surfaces, and I really don't care if they are a bit more matte and scratched up like on this tea kettle, or if it's something really shiny like on a sword or something like that. Both versions are quite a lot of fun to me. For a dull metallic surface, or like on this tea kettle, I use a variety of darker and lighter greys, and also I put some light blues in there for good measure to show reflecting light from the sky. Other than that, for a dull surface it's just a bit of smooth blending, and that's a lot of fun to me. Of course, I also added a bit of texture to the lower side of the tea kettle where it maybe would touch the fire and get a bit more oxidized. And after that was done, I also tried to paint some very slight object source lighting effects on it using the fluorescent orange I used earlier for the bonfire as well. At first I thought that I would like to do way heavier OSL on the snow, for example, but I tried it out on a test piece and it didn't look that great. Also, since my bonfire is almost burned down and only a bit smoldering, I thought there wouldn't be so much light that would be emitted around the snow, and maybe just a bit on the shiny teapot. And since I didn't want the two guys riding on the Aerosan to burn their fingers when touching their tea kettle, I also added the wood colored handle on top, so they are safe. You might notice that I didn't show you the underside of this tea kettle, for one simple reason: there's nothing happening down there. I just painted it in German grey and that's it. Nothing fancy to it. And then it was time to test my patience again with hanging that tea kettle on the cooking tripod. But that worked surprisingly well. And while I worked on the Aerosan model itself and painted the shovel on the side, I also painted this pickaxe and this normal axe that I now added to the diorama. Sadly, there isn't any footage of the painting process, since I somehow forgot to turn on my camera. But I used the same techniques that I also used for the shovel on the Aerosan. And since in my mind fishing is something where I imagine you do a lot of waiting, I thought I also include a small wooden crate so the guys can sit down while waiting for the fish to bite. This wooden crate comes from a mini art set, and the paints I used to paint it are my beloved Scale 75 Artist Acrylics. I really like those paints because they behave a lot like oil paints, but they dry way faster. As you can see, I start out with a light base coat of Tamiya Deck 10, and then I put down a few dabs of paint all over the surface. And since they take a lot longer to dry than normal acrylic paints, you can use a large and flat brush to blend them slightly together. This process is quite fast, and I decided to spend not too much time on the wooden surface at all, since I decided to paint over it with a green paint to get one more green element in the diorama that matches up with the trousers of one of the miniatures. After I was happy with the acrylic finish, I brought out my dark umber pen liner to pronounce the individual pieces of wood and the wood grain a bit more. And of course, after the enamel paint had a few minutes to dry, I used a piece of kitchen paper, slightly wet with a bit of enamel thinner, and wiped the excess off. My initial idea was to cover this crate now in shipping fluid, paint it green and then chip the green paint away to show the wood underneath, but I didn't actually use this technique. I did cover it in shipping fluid, but after painting the green paints on in thin glazes, I decided that I pretty much liked the look, so I didn't try to reactivate the chipping fluid, and I didn't do any chipping at all. I took a bunch of green colors and glazed them over the wooden surface until I was happy with the look. And I guess if you watched one of my other videos, you also know that I like to highlight everything, so in the end I used a very light greenish grey and edge highlighted all the individual planks and the wood grain a bit. I'm sure I've said this before, but finishing small details like this is a lot of fun to me. You can sit down for 1 or 2 hours on the modeling bench, and after you walk away you were actually able to finish something, and I enjoy that feeling a lot. After I was done with the highlighting steps, I also added a bit of winter streaking grimes to the upper edges of the crate that will touch the floor, so it looks like there's some moisture that soaked into the wooden crate from the icy surface. And there was no need to make it any more complicated. I just dabbed a bit of winter streaking grime to the lower edges and then used my mineral spirits to blend them slightly over the surface in an irregular pattern. After I was done with the wooden crate, I also thought about maybe adding a bucket with a few fish in it that were already caught, but I shied away from that idea. I think there's actually a point where you can put too much detail into a diorama and it kind of gets overcrowded, and I didn't want to get to this point. A bit of CA glue for the wooden crate to hold it in place, and then it was time for the most important part. As you might know, a radial engine without a puddle of oil under it is either brand new from the factory and not yet filled up with oil, or it's completely empty, and that's bad as well. So I made sure to integrate the Aerosan. I add a big oil stain underneath in the snow. I put down a bit of aircraft engine oil effects with my brush and then used mineral spirits to blend it over the snow. I wasn't completely happy with that, so I also used the speckling technique to add smaller drops of oil all around it and make it a bit less uniform. I also really enjoyed this step because I think it added a bit of interesting texture to the snow that otherwise looks a bit boring because it's overall quite uniform. And since we are on a frozen lake, there wasn't any opportunity to add something like mud stains in the snow. And if you want to see how I painted those miniatures, leave a like down below and I will upload a video especially focusing on the miniature painting. And while you take a look at the final result, once again, thank you so much for the amazing support. Please leave me a comment down below telling me which part of this project you enjoyed most. Also, like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done that yet, that would help me out a lot. And thanks again to my amazing Patreons. Check out my Patreon page for free high quality pictures, STL files, ad-free videos and regular workbench updates. Hope to see you all next time. Take care.